Hey, all right, I'm going to get this little ditty going. I know it's Saturday, so thanks for sticking around. I know you have a choice of learning centers, so I really appreciate the fact that you came to this learning center. So I'm Fred Below. I'm a professor of crop physiology, Department of Crop Sciences at the University of Illinois. And, I'm going to start out this performance, but the real heavy lifting is going to be done by Scott Foxhoven here. In 2 months, Scott Foxhoven will be Dr. Foxhoven. and you have the pleasure of getting a condensed version of his entire PhD. But so I'm going to set up the stage. Now, I would love to say I taught Scott everything he knows, but the sad fact isn't true. But I did teach Scott a very important lesson, and that lesson is the correct pose to take when you're in a field picture. So see the correct pose there? Scott looks a little confused there, but I'm going to tell you, he's a quick learner. After about 30 times, he got it right. Now, Scott is not the only one that helps me. I have a really fantastic team of students and technicians. I got 3 technicians, 9 graduate students. This is my team. Here's the sad fact. 6 of them are going to graduate. So I'm rebuilding next year. Going to have to get some new students. And if you have sons or daughters that are smart and skilled and have a good college degree, I'd like to talk to them, to help rebuild this team. I also have to thank my sponsor today, sitting right here, Marion Calmer. So I heard a rumor that he's giving away a corn head at the end of the presentation to some lucky person, so you'll want to come to the booth for that. So Mary and I are, we're obviously old dogs, but we can be educated. And I have photographic proof that this guy and I can be educated, because here's Marion and I at a learning center, soaking up the knowledge. Marion, it doesn't look like we're actually paying attention, but
You got scolded for talking.
yeah, I remember that. So I'll tell you a little bit about where we do our research. This is where we do our research. We're from Illinois. University of Illinois is located near Champaign, so we have a research site there. But we also have 2 excellent farm collaborators in the northern and southern part of the state. So many thanks to Stewart Farms in Yorkville, Barding Farms in Nashville. Couldn't do the work without it. So if you look at this picture, Illinois is a long state from north to south, 390 miles. And there's a huge difference in the inherent soil fertility as you go from the north to the south. I'm showing you here some of the average soil test values over the last 4 years. And so if you look up in Yorkville, geez, that's almost 5% organic matter. Look at that CEC. Look at that inherent levels of base fertility. As you go down south in the state, the fertility gets a little worse. Champaign's in the middle. Gosh, there's soil down in Nashville somewhere. I'm not sure where they're hiding it when I'm down there. I think they're afraid I'm going to take it. Big difference in soil fertility from north to south. Now, I know you're thinking, well, why is that? Why is there such a big difference in soil fertility? And, if you know Illinois, that's where Chicago is, right there. And I'm pretty sure the crap from Chicago flows downhill. That's my theory. Well, maybe glaciers played some role too. I'm not sure. But so we do our research here so we can have different levels of soil fertility. Some of the work Scott will show you have been done at these sites. We also get different weather. But one thing we do not want is variation due to equipment. So we use the same research equipment at every site. And man, we got some sweet research equipment. Here we are, this is our transport convoy. We're ready to go to one of our outlying sites. Look, there's our banding toolbar. That's the star of the show today. Our banding toolbar, we got our liquid bar, we got our planter, you know, we got our dry spreader, we got water, seed, fertilizer. You do not want to be stuck behind us when we're going to one of the research sites, I got to tell you. We bring everything with us when we go to the site. We even bring this important piece of equipment. The equipment's powered by diesel, but the students are powered by caffeine. And here's another lesson that Scott learned. Scott learned if you plug that coffee maker into the 12-volt outlet of your 450 truck, it'll spark and smoke, and you might end up with a new 450 truck. So now we bring the generator. Now, I'm going to try and engage you in some questions as we go. And so my first question to you is, how do you know if a politician likes corn? Now this is a pretty important question, because politicians make policy. And you never know what a politician is thinking, and you can't really trust what they're saying. So how do you know if a politician likes corn? Well, I can tell you, despite all of his faults, former President Trump was a corn lover. How could he not have been? Now, I am not a politician, but I'm also a corn lover. Now, if you look, President Trump is more of a pollination guy. I'm a brown silk guy. I'm not sure about President Biden. I don't know if President Biden likes corn or not, but the photographic evidence suggests that maybe President Biden really doesn't like corn that much. All right, another question for you. What's the world record yield of corn, and what's known as the corn yield gap? You're here at the National Corn Growers Contest. You guys know the record yield of corn. So the world record yield of corn is 616.1953. Honest to God, they carry that contest out to 10 thousandths of a bushel. I don't think they got this significant digit lesson in science class, because I'll say that's damn close to 616. That's Dave Hula out of Virginia, 2019. By the way, Mr. Hula broke 600 again, the first person to ever do it. Now, the average yield of corn in the U.S. is around 178 bushels. I know that's a crop failure for you guys, but that's the average yield in the U.S. And so the yield gap is the difference between the record yield and the average yield. 438 bushels. That's the opportunity for you to increase your corn yield with better crop management. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, Dr. Below, what's your laboratory's record? So what's the crop physiology laboratory's yield record? 411 bushels. Now, it's a little different than what you do. This is, statistically replicated plots. 411. Now, by the way, 411 is a fair bit less than 600. And a lot of you guys in the National Corn Growers Contest are beating me. And I'm supposed to be some famous, corn yield scientist. How come I can't do as well as the people in the U.S. National Corn Growers Contest? Well, remember, I'm from Illinois, and there's two problems in Illinois. One of them is clouds. Apparently clouds block the sun. And the other one is Democrats. We got a lot of Democrats in Illinois, and so we're always fighting against that. But still, that is a respectable yield, and that yield is good enough to get me as part of the club, the high yield club. So here I am with Mr. Hula, the world record holder for corn, and there's Randy Dowdy, the world record holder for soybean. And we're not in the field, so we're not doing the pose, but Now, I want to dispel a rumor. There's a nasty rumor, and the rumor is that I called these guys jackasses. Or at least one of them a jackass. And I want to go on record as saying that they are not jackasses. I mean, just look at the size of these guys compared to me. Do you honestly think I'd come out unscathed if I called them a jackass? Well, I'm really happy I cleared that up. So what does our record yield look like? So 411 bushel per corn, this is what it looked like. This is how we did it. 52,000 plants per acre, narrow rows. By the way, with the star of the show, banded fertility. We're going to tell you why that's so important. We also used irrigation. Most of the high yields come with irrigation. We have a subsurface drip irrigation, and we did a couple of foliar protections. So that is what 411 bushels looks like. Now, by the way, you could make corn yield into a math equation by looking at the three yield components. So corn yield is the product function of three key yield components. How many plants you have per acre, how many kernels are in each plant, and the weight of each individual kernel. And an increase or decrease in any one of these can be responsible for an increase or decrease in yield. And these act at different times in the growth and the life of the plant. Plants per acre, that's planting and emergence. Kernels per plant, flowering. Weight per kernel, grain fill. Now you have to increase at least one of these to increase yield. Sitting here today, which one do you have the most control over? Plants per acre. I mean, gosh, you actually have to buy the seed. Plants per acre, that's the yield component under your control that has the biggest impact on corn yield. I'm going to show you the average yield of corn in the U.S. over the last 60 years, and then I'll superimpose over that the average planting density during that same time period. So what I'm showing you here, this is the average yield of corn in the U.S. That's the orange triangle. A light-eye orange, by the way. And I want you to notice that the average yield of corn in the U.S. goes up and down depending on that year's weather. I mean, here's a few weather fiascos. But on average, it goes up about 2 bushels per acre per year. And associated with that has been a linear increase in the number of plants planted. That's the blue line. I want you to hearken back to 1965. In 1965, the average yield of corn in the U.S. was 70 bushels, planting less than 20,000 plants per acre. Probably a 38-inch row, maybe a 40-inch row, maybe even some hills. And now, 55 years later, the average yield is more than doubled, and the average planting density in the U.S. last year is just under 32,000 plants per acre. Guess what? It's got to go up. I know a lot of you know I'm a huge advocate of narrow rows. Not going to talk much about that today, but I'm a huge advocate of narrow rows, largely to manage a higher density of plants. You know, so nowadays, most of us are in 30-inch rows. Some of us take a little bit longer time to learn, because I have a picture of our sponsor here. 1974, a young Marion Calmer he's still planting hills then, by the way, 20,000 plants per acre and a 40-inch hill in 1974. So, I mean, are you a slow learner? Or Now then, of course, you jump right from this to 15-inch row corn. So no messing around, man, when you're going to make a change. If you look at plant population, it goes up a little under 400 plants per acre per year. Now, I have another question for you, and this is related to plant population. As I increase the population of plants, what happens to the size of each plant's root system? So more plants means each size root system is smaller. I have photographic evidence, because this is my graduate students' favorite task. I mean, just ask Scott. I see one of my other former graduate students here. Just ask them what they'd rather be doing on a hot day. Washing roots, they love it. Talk about a good time. Look at this sweet root washing setup. So here we are, you know, we're hauling the roots out of the field. We're soaking them in water, and then we're pressure washing them. I mean, talk about fun. Then we're going to take these roots, and we're going to scan them and weigh them. I mean, there's nothing that my graduate students would rather do than dig and wash roots. I mean, look at the sheer happiness on the face of these students as they're digging roots. Now, here's Scott digging roots, and Scott, get with the program, man. I mean, I don't know what's wrong with him. So, photographic evidence shows that as I increase the population of plants, each plant has a distinctly smaller root system. There you see the picture. By the way, we quantified this by actually weighing them. So there's the weight. I'm presenting the weight in grams. I use the SI unit grams to make this appear more scientific. But notice the weight goes down. And if I have these weights, I can quantify the rate of decline. And I'm going to tell you, for every 1,000 more plants per acre, you have 2.5% less roots. So as you increase the density of plants by only 1,000, each plant has 2.5% less roots. Now I have a theory. I mean, this is what us academic types do, right? We come up with these theories. And my theory is that mineral nutrients enter the plant through the root. Pretty sure I can prove that theory. Enter the plant through the root. Now let's think about this, right? If mineral nutrients enter the plant through the root, let me ask you another nutrient-related question. And the question is, when were soil test values calibrated to corn yield? What year? So what year was soil test values calibrated to corn yield? In the 60s and early 70s. And by the way, we're using the same values today. 60s and early 70s. Now I think, has anything changed in how we're farming between the 60s and 70s and now? Remember, we're growing more plants. So that is when soil test value was calibrated to corn yield. 70 bushels, roots, you know, looked like that. Now we have smaller roots, higher yield potential. This makes me wonder. I'm going to ask you another question. Does growing more plants that have smaller root systems and using a 60-year-old soil test system, does this mean we have to change how we fertilize the crop? Spoiler alert. Yes! That's the whole purpose of why we got to place fertility. All right, well, back to the yield components. I already talked about plants per acre, so we know we're planting more plants that got smaller root systems. And now what I want to do is I want to try and increase kernels per plant and weight per kernel. You know, greedy as I am, I'd like to increase all of these, right? I mean, do the math. Look at what yields you can achieve if you could increase them all. By the way, that's not very easy. And the reason it's not very easy is because of what's called yield component compensation. And that means as I have more plants per acre, each plant has less kernels. I got some of Scott's data here that I'm going to show it to you, 10 different hybrids. So Scott has 10 hybrids, increase the population, looking at the kernels per plant. And I want you to notice that as I increase the density, each plant has less kernels. Now, there is quite a range among the hybrids. This is the range among the 10 hybrids. So you know, there is a range. The other problem, of course, is the more kernels per plant, the smaller the weight of each individual kernel. Again, I can show this to you here. These are the 10 hybrids. Some of these hybrids have a lot of kernels, which means they have small kernel weights. And some of them don't have many kernels, which means they have bigger kernel weights. This is the challenge that you're after. You got to increase these yield components. It's almost impossible to increase them simultaneously. How are you going to break that negative relationship? I'll tell you what I'd love to see happen. I'd love to see the national corn growers require yield components as part of the yield contest. Because then I could know how you achieved it. And then I could do the math myself and, see if you actually achieved it. This is the problem. This is what you're all managing. When you're growing yield, you can plant the number of plants, but then you've got to manage the number of kernels and the weight per kernel, and they're negatively related. So the question is, how can we reverse this negative relationship? I want to ensure high yields by reversing that negative relationship. How are we going to do that? And the answer is related to today's topic: better fertilizer placement. Better fertilizer placement. This is what we have to do as we have more plants with smaller root systems, and we're trying to break this relationship. So I got one last thing I'm going to show you, and this is a historic picture. I'm going to harken back to 2009. This is the first time I got my hands on a banding toolbar. So 2009, banding toolbar. We ran the toolbar through both rows, but this row got the fertilizer, mostly phosphate fertilizer, a little sulfur and zinc too. This row didn't get the fertilizer, but this is a soil that has a 45 part per million p-test. That'd be 90 pounds P2O5. So soil test says you don't need any screaming improvement. By the way, this was the best plant response I'd seen in my entire career. Well, short of killing a plant with glyphosate. That's pretty cool too. But done it 100 times. Seen it every single time. Scott's going to show you some examples. I'm going to show you one more example. So here's another example. There's the banded fertility. This is one adequate soil test. The same hybrid planted the same day, picture taken the same day. Now, if we were over here on this side, we'd be going, this is pretty good corn. That's because we don't have that one right next to it. Now, if you take a close-up look down the row, you see one of the problems that I think a lot of you are facing, and that's what I call a plant left behind. See this guy right here? He came up a little later than his neighbors, and he is behind. A lot of things cause that, but a big factor is fertility. Fertility. I want no plant left behind. So if you look here, see this guy right here, standard population, broadcast fertility, based on a soil test. See that guy right there? He came up a few days after his neighbors, and he is behind. And there's not a single thing you can do to that plant to make it catch up. I mean, you can try. You can get out and hug it, sing to it, sleep next to it. You can piss on it. I've tried it more than once. Usually makes it a little worse. And I'll guarantee you this plant's going to have a smaller ear than its neighbors. And if it turns out dry, it's a weed. But when we band that fertility right under the row, even when we have more plants, not only do we have less plants left behind, but they grow faster. Young corn plants sense their fertility from an early age, and it sets the growth and yield potential. It's like taking the dimmer switch in yield and turning her all the way up. Young plants sense their fertility, and it sets their potential. Now, I'm not going to tell you that guaranteed it has a higher yield than that, but it sure sets the stage. Now, I know you're all wondering, well, how am I going to place this fertility, and what happens if I do it? So I'm going to turn it over to Scott Foxhoven here. He is going to share with you some of his PhD research on banded fertility. And then we'll come back with questions afterwards. So thank you very much.
Test. Thank you, Dr. Below, very much. As he said, my name is Scott Foxhoven, and even though I've gotten that pose down, I don't know if I'll ever be as funny as Dr. Below. But, like he said, I have been doing my research with him over the last 5 years. Really what I focused on using the 4 R's of nutrient stewardship to really improve corn yield. That's using the better fertilizer source, rate, timing, and placement. Now, I really want to focus on placement today. And when I talk about placement, this is the piece of equipment that we're using to place that fertility right underneath that crop row. So here we have a Montag box on top of a Coulter-type toolbar. Now, we're not exactly the same as a strip-till operation. Because we're on small plot research with the University of Illinois, I'm in full conventional tillage. And when I'm comparing nitrogen-only control to broadcast to banding, I have that toolbar go through every single plot. So everything I'm going to show you guys today has the exact same tillage. What I'm going to show you is what happens when you put a fertilizer granule on the surface or when you put it right underneath that crop row. Now, like Dr. Below said, we've been doing this quite a bit, and we see this response almost every single time that I put that fertilizer right underneath that crop row. I'm using RTK and GPS on my banding tractor and that planter. And the same day, if not maybe 24 hours after planting or after banding, I'm planting that crop right on top of that band. Here, I have a crop that's the same hybrid, same planting population, and the same planting date. This even has the exact same fertility program as well. The difference between these two crops is I have broadcast P and K on the left, and I put banded P and K there on that right side. Now, I know a lot of pictures can be cherry-picked, but I can guarantee you, any time that we do this, this is a giant study we did across the entire field. When I put that fertility close to that row, massive growth response. And I can also tell you that this becomes extremely important when you get into tougher conditions. In 2021, we got a little eager. I went out and planted this crop on April 6th. It didn't come out of the ground for almost 3 weeks. Now, you have a pretty big response right there, right? Now, I want you guys to count the number of leaves that you see on that corn plant. A lot of people say that that corn plant's living on that seed until V4, and there's nothing you can do to change its yield potential until after V4. That is not the case. You have 1, 2, 3 leaves, maybe a couple leaves beyond that as well. That corn plant is starting to sense its fertility, set its yield trajectory the second it's coming up out of that ground. So if you're going to start going after that early planting, which is more and more common, that fertility has become even more essential. Now let's take a look at some of the yield responses that we get with this banded fertility applications. So I did a study with 10 hybrids. Dr. Below showed you some of that data. We also did this across 3 different populations. Now my nitrogen-only control, just relying on the soil test, I had 203 bushels per acre. This is all standardized at 15.5% moisture. When I put down 80 pounds of P2O5 and 60 pounds of K2O as MAP and MOP, I got a respectable 17 bushels per acre. But this was the interesting part. When I put that crop nutrient right beneath that row, I got an extra 8 bushels without putting any more fertilizer out there. Now, a better question here is, does planting population affect corn response to fertility? I want you guys to think about this in your mind. Yes, no. How would planting population affect your response to those fertilized nutrients? Well, it's a big fat yes. It is a huge impact. I'll show you guys the exact same data set here. My left side here, I have populations from 30, 36, and 42,000 plants per acre. Now that nitrogen-only control, if you remember, was about 200 bushels per acre. And across those 10 hybrids, when I was only at 30,000 plants per acre, I had good response to fertility, but there was no need to band. Okay, when I went to 36,000 plants per acre, though, there's a little bit bigger of a difference, 9 bushels per acre. That was the difference of placement when I was at 36,000. When I go to 42,000, like you guys would expect, that placement effect was going to continue to increase. Now, why in the world do I have a bigger yield response to banding at higher populations here, but that response to fertility goes down when I was broadcasting at higher populations? I have more mouths to feed. I should need that fertility more. I should be getting a bigger response to that fertility, right? Well, if you guys were listening to what Dr. Below said, what happens when I go to 42,000 plants per acre? That root system gets a lot smaller, doesn't it? When I'm putting out broadcast fertility, I'm fertilizing the entire soil. We just told you that that corn plant at 42,000 plants per acre, it's not exploring the entire soil. If I'm broadcasting, that smaller root system, it just simply can't get to a lot of those fertilized nutrients. But if I put them right beneath that crop row where they can actually get to it, then I can utilize every applied nutrient that I put out there. Now, Dr. Below also talked to you guys about changing that yield component trend line. Well, what he showed you there was actually our nitrogen-only control from this study. When I increase the number of kernels per plant, the weight of that kernel goes down. Now I'll show you what happens if I do that same exact analysis, but I'm using banded fertility. I'm able to break that negative relationship between adding more kernels and not lowering the weight per kernel. This is done by having that fertility concentrated in the beginning, but also making sure it's available later into the season when I have grain fill really starting to pick up. Now there's another thing, we talked about grain yield a lot. Not a lot of people think about the actual stover biomass that we're producing. So we're going to talk here with the populations of 30 to 42,000 plants per acre, the amount of stover that I produce with my 3 different placements of nutrients, either no fertility, broadcast, or banding. Now, a lot of you guys think of stover as trash. Stover is all of the biomass of that crop that's left out in the field after the combine goes through. It's not going into the grain tank. And what you're going to see is when I add in broadcast fertility, I increase that yield by about that 17 bushels per acre, but I also increased a half a ton of that dry stover. This is 0% moisture. We measure all this at the end of the year and we dry it down. Now on top of that, when I did banding, I doubled the increase of stover production compared to broadcast as far as that rate of increase. I have almost a ton of stover. Now again, a lot of people think of stover as trash, but really, when you have more yield, you're going to have more stover, and stover is not trash. You want to know why stover is not trash? How many of you guys have been to a presentation today, or this entire conference, and you've had the word carbon drilled into your heads again and again and again? It's getting a little annoying, but I'm going to do it one more time, and I'm going to tell you that stover is not trash because what is stover? Stover is carbon. Because I know what the concentration of carbon is in stover, and I know how many pounds of carbon is in a carbon credit, I can tell you that a carbon credit is about 600 pounds of stover per acre. So doing math, I can sit here and convert all of my stover values into what would theoretically be a carbon credit. Now, nobody is going to pay me for these 5.9 carbon credits per acre, because that's just what you have to do to grow corn. You put out some nitrogen, you grow a crop. I'm also probably not going to get anybody to pay me for the 0.7 carbon credits per acre that I got with just broadcasting P and K, because that's, again, it's standard practice. It's nothing special. You're putting out P and K like normal. But when I put down that band of fertility, I was able to increase my carbon back into that soil by 0.06 credits per acre, and I used the exact same amount of inputs. So guys, some key takeaways here. Banded fertility does have the potential to increase yield without increasing inputs. We saw that pretty evidently. On top of that, higher planting populations. You're going to have a smaller root system. You're going to have to start putting that fertility where those roots can actually get to it, especially with some of you guys that are pushing higher populations of 36 all the way up to 42,000 plants per acre. And then lastly, these new carbon markets, they might give you a little bit higher ROI potential when it comes to banding. But that is if you manage that stover correctly. The reality is you guys call it trash, or everyone calls it trash, because sometimes it can be really hard to manage. You have nitrogen tie-up in the spring if you don't handle that carbon. I'm not an expert in this, but I do know that Marion Calmer and his team down at the booth will really be able to give you more details on how to manage carbon. I will be there to help you guys with the fertility aspect as well. So guys, I just showed you that banding was pretty great, right? But I do have a pretty common criticism about pre-plant banding. When I've talked to some growers, a lot of people agree that banding does provide superior season-long fertility. There is one reality, is that a lot of people are nervous about time management. If I want to do pre-plant banding, and maybe I don't get across every single acre because it was a wet year or something, well then what do I do with those acres that I couldn't get that P and K down with? they might think that's an all or nothing approach. Now I'm going to tell you that there is a potential solution to in-season nutrient management, and that is precision placing those in-season nutrient applications. This is also known as banding, but banding doesn't always have to mean pre-plant. I want to talk to you guys about some different types of banding. Okay? You guys have already banded before, or you've seen it before. It's called Y-drop. You can put that liquid fertilizer right alongside that crop row in season. That's banding, right? Now this is a commercial Y-drop machine. That thing looks pretty pretty right there, right? I mean, I'd like to have one of those on my farm, but you guys have to tell me which machine looks better, our research Y-drop applicator or this commercial Y-drop applicator. And I don't know about you guys, but that's a pretty stellar looking machine right there. I don't think even the commercial Y-drop can get that placement just as fine-tuned as that. But I will say, we've done this with liquid fertilizer quite a bit, nitrogen. Now I want to address in-season P and K. And I do have a little bit of problems when I'm working with stuff other than nitrogen. We've done liquid Y-drop with P, K, sulfur, zinc, and boron. That's a lot of letters, guys. Sometimes they don't always play nice together. We had salting out issues in a bad way. Okay? The other aspect of this, and I know this is very close to home for a lot of you guys, and that is nutrient cost. When I wanted to put out 40 pounds of P2O5, 30 pounds of K2O, when I was using liquid sources, 1034O and potassium acetate, I was looking at a pretty $87 per acre for those nutrients. When I compared that to MAP and MOP2 dry sources at the same rate, that was $27 per acre. And guys, this is back in 2018 before the cost of fertilizer went through the roof. So we have to find maybe a better solution to addressing that in-season P and K if I couldn't get out there with a banding toolbar. And that, guys, is what I'm going to say is dry drop. That is your solution right there. I'm going to give you guys a second. You're all thinking, what in the world is dry drop? I have never heard of that before. And that's fine because we made it up. Okay, at the University of Illinois, me and Dr. Below, we get some crazy ideas going. And dry drop is kind of what you guys might think it sounds like. It's dry fertilizer Y-dropped right alongside that crop row. Here's nitrogen and P and K. It looks pretty out in the field. Now, if I had this application method, you might be thinking there's no way I can actually apply this in the real world, right? How would I make this happen on a production field? Well, the technology might not be there right away, but it's not far off. I would say this is what I would call as a potential dry drop machine. You guys have seen one of these before. This is an air boom that's already got drops set up on it. It's ready to go out and make an in-season application. Now, all you have to do to get that dry Y-drop is you have to put a vent at the bottom of that dry drop. We used one similar to the vents that we have on our Montag delivery system for our pre-plant banding toolbar. So I'm going to vent that fertilizer and I'm going to install a Y-drop apparatus. And then I can put that fertilizer right alongside that crop row. Okay, so we're talking in-season P and K. The bigger question that I get when I bring up this is what about incorporation? We're putting dry, immobile nutrients right on that soil surface. Well, guys, you actually can get dry fertilizer to incorporate using water, even if you're in dry land. Now, that is because a corn plant does have a unique architecture in its leaves. It can funnel that water down to the base of that plant. This is a photo that we had from our lab. You go out there after a light rain, you will see that in between the two rows, it is dry. And right alongside the base of that plant, it is wet. Okay, if you look through the literature, about 40 to 50% of an annual rain, or of a single rainfall will go down to the base of that plant. And then if you have a light rainfall, like I said, of maybe 1/10 of an inch, you go out to that field and you look in between those two rows. It'll be dry. Almost 100% of that water goes right down to the base of that plant. Okay, so we have this grand idea to do dry Y-drop. Now we've got to test it. So in 2020 and 2021, I put out a 4R fertility study. We did Champaign, Illinois, the U of I campus, and then we also worked with Bartling Farms down in Nashville, Illinois. Now I tested 2 different sets of fertilizer. So MAP and MOP, your commodity fertilizers, and then also Micro Essentials SZ and Aspire. Those are 2 products from Mosaic. Now I put out 80 pounds of P2O5 and 60 pounds of K2O, but because I was also comparing it to these products right here, I also tested 20 pounds of sulfur, a pound of zinc, and a half a pound of boron. And we said this is really a placement study because I'm looking at broadcast, pre-plant banding, and dry drop. I did this dry drop application at V5. So when we look at the soil test for this location, just give you guys a little bit of background. Like Dr. Below said, that southern Illinois location is going to be a little less fertile. Overall, our phosphate levels, this is Malic 3, our phosphate levels in the soil are pretty good, but we were a little low on potassium. So I'm expecting this site to have good potassium responses. So overall, we're going to dive right into the grain yield here, guys. I'm going to have a lot going on, so I'm going to walk you through it. So I have our timing and placement right here, fertilizer sources, the 3 years that I did this study, or the 3 sites I did this study, and my 3-year average. Not bad yields, definitely a little bit variable. Some years I had 285 bushels per acre, all the way down to 185, or 189. We look at that broadcast application of MAP and MOP, MESZ, and Aspire. This is all spring applied, lightly incorporated. My responses weren't too bad, 2 bushels all the way up to 19 bushels per acre. But when I looked at the response of the sulfur, zinc, and boron, it was about 6 bushels per acre. Okay, now when I looked at pre-plant banding, okay, the responses seem to be a little higher, maybe a little more variable too, and that is because you guys are all looking at this number right here. The reality is we did have a little bit of boron toxicity. When you do research, you got to explore. You're going to have some ups, you're going to have some downs. We found that if you put a high concentration of boron real close to a seedling, you kind of have a little bit of negative effects some years. Not every year, but some years. But overall, when I look at my response to pre-plant banding with MAP and MOP, I got an additional 8 bushels per acre using the exact same amount of nutrients. Okay? I just showed you a study before where that was the exact same case. 8 bushels per acre, no extra fertility. Although I didn't have a yield response to banding with the microessentials SE and Aspire, that was a reality because of some of that boron in some of those years. Now this is another interesting one. V5 dry drop. You guys are interested to see what in the world did that yield, right? Well, honestly, I was pretty surprised. I had some pretty good yield responses across the entire board. When I looked compared to pre-plant broadcasting, I got an additional 9 bushels per acre when I put MAP and MOP in a V5 dry drop compared to that pre-plant broadcast. Now, I also got an additional 6 bushels per acre when I put the microessentials SZ and Aspire in there. And that's a lot of that reason is because the MESZ and Aspire had a higher yield with broadcast to begin with. That was the highest yield of the study that I achieved. And I was able to put out a high concentration of boron right next to that crop row without any safety issues. So guys, just in general, when we take a look at the yield efficiency of this study, the amount of yield that I could increase per pound of P and K that I applied, no matter what I did, even if I put Aspire in there a little bit hot sometimes, I was able to increase the yield efficiency that I was getting per pound of P and K that I applied. Just looking at MAP and MOP, we'll take out some of the sulfur, zinc, and boron. Whether I was concentrating that fertilizer as pre-plant or as a V5 dry drop, I was able to double the efficiency of yield increase per those fertilized nutrients. Now, banding, it's great efficiency. This is my favorite application method that we have tested over the 5 years. But the reality is sometimes it's time sensitive. I want a backup option in case I don't get to that last 500 acres. And I think if you have a backup option, you're a lot more willing to do this application method. And with that dry drop, like I said, it's a great backup application, and I have a wider window to make that application. And we also had some next steps with this. We talked about liquid Y drop being the original in-season banding. So how does dry drop compare to liquid Y drop? We actually did test this against the same treatments I just showed you earlier. So we have that nitrogen-only control. This is the same study. When I put down a half rate of fertility, 40 pounds of P2O5 and 30 pounds of K2O, I cut the rate because it's really hard to put out a full rate of liquid. So when I put out 1034O and potassium acetate, I had respectable yield increases, 12, 4, and 12, an average of 9 bushels per acre. Pretty good efficiency too, considering I'm only putting down a half rate of fertilizer. But when I compared that to that V5 dry drop, I also put this one out at a half rate of fertility, 5, 8, 15, and actually averaged to be the exact same over 3 different site years. Now, with that dry Y drop, it's a little bit less expensive compared to the liquid P and K. Now, liquid nitrogen, really comparable. When you start looking at liquid potassium, it gets pretty hard to make the economics work with just 9 bushel yield increase. So guys, some key takeaways here. Banding is going to be even more important when you're working with commodity fertilizers. With MAP and MOP, we saw great responses to concentrating those nutrients. I'm getting the most out of every single pound of P2O5 and K2O if I place it when I'm using commodity fertilizers. Also, I was surprised, dry drop had surprisingly similar yield efficiencies compared to pre-plant banding. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it to be the primary application, but I think it's a great backup method if you can't get across every acre come springtime. And then lastly, dry drop did provide more flexibility on timing, as well as the fertilizer source that I was going to choose. I could use concentrated forms of boron, put them really close to that crop row, and not have to worry about safety. And then guys, the last thing here, the final takeaway. This is from what Dr. Below talked to you about, and what I just got done talking to you guys about. Season-long fertility is going to be crucial for achieving those higher corn yields. And the way that is done is we have to optimize those 4 R's. And the goal is to break that negative relationship between those yield components. I want to increase all 3 at the same time. And if I can do that, that is how you get to those higher yields. Guys, I also want to say thank you to everybody at the Crop Physiology Lab, as well as the sponsors that helped us in 2021. This is not in order of funding amounts or anything. This is alphabetical order. I don't know about you guys, but I've been at the University of Illinois and just Illinois for 5 years. The state's pretty much flat broke. And so you're not going to get a dime from any grants or anything. We rely on the support from these guys to really help us have the support we need to come up with these crazy ideas like dry drop and pre-plant banding. And then lastly, I would like to thank Calmer Corn Heads and then all of you guys for attending this session and listening to me and Dr. Below. Really great to have a full crowd here. And with that, Dr. Below, I think we can answer some questions.
Shockingly, we left time for questions. I want to do a little business before we get to the questions. If you are a CCA and you want CCA credit, make sure you scan your badge outside the door. On your table, there are some of these forms. These are the rating forms. There's more outside. By the way, if we did not suck, please fill the form out. If you want me here next year, you got to fill the form out because that determines who the speakers are. So I really encourage you to fill out this form. I also am going to tell you that after the session, we're going to answer all the questions you can, but after the session, Scott and I will be in the Calmer Cornheads booth. The rest of the trade show, we'd love to have you come by, talk with you individually. So before we get to that, who has the first question? Yes, sir.
What is the difference on the green snap broadcast versus
Re-paraphrase, yeah.
Yes, so the question was, what is the difference of green snap from broadcast compared to banding? And believe it or not, in our research, I didn't have time to show it all. In 2021, just this last year, I had really bad stock lodging in green snap. And I saw that banded fertility almost cut the incidence of green snap in half. And a lot of that comes from the fact of that banded fertility. Having more available potassium, we've seen increases stalk width, stalk height, and just overall stalk integrity. So we have actually decreased the amount of green snap that we've had with banding. Now I do know one thing I'll say is a lot of the time, sometimes that if you're banding, you're pushing higher populations. So as a systems approach, if you're really going up to 42,000 plants per acre, you might have more green snap just because you're at higher populations. So, next question.
Right here.
yeah, this was all conventional, I understand. Now, we were in a total no-till. It makes sense that by banding in no-till where the soil will not trail, does it make sense that the roots need the fertilizer, I guess it does, better and faster in no-till by placing it closer to the root? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I think the question was is if I was in a no-till system and I started banding those nutrients right underneath the crop row, would I have a better response compared to conventional till? And I would say yes. I think when you're in that no-till system and you don't have that seed bed is fully uniform like we would in conventional till, having those nutrients closer to that crop row is going to be even more important. We have not tested that, but that's what my assumption would be.
Under the row would be close to the row.
Close to the row. So maybe that V5 dry drop I was talking about.
Yeah.
Okay, so would V5 dry drop be better in a no-till system compared to conventional? I think that is a possibility. Yes, we have not tested it in no-till, but from my understanding of how crop roots will grow, I think it would.
Should be the same. Right?
Yeah.
Another question here.
Was there a reason you used potassium acetate as a liquid form and ammonium polyphosphate and not potassium chloride liquefied and 54 phosphoric acid, which would be cheaper than acetate and ammonium polyphosphate?
Yeah, so the question was, why did we decide to use potassium acetate in 1034O compared to phosphoric acid and melted down 0060 to get 0012? To be honest, guys, it was what I had in the shop at the time. I would assume that if you can find a better price point with those liquids and you use phosphoric acid and melt it down to, or potash to 0012, if that works for your guys' system, I would definitely go for it. I use what we had available to us.
Yeah, and we get our fertilizer for free, so cost is not an object.
Scott, when we look at that the dry drop versus wide drop liquid, they were both made at V5, and we didn't see a different, or we saw a difference in the response where the liquid was a little bit better, right? Would you recommend maybe doing that dry drop earlier to give a chance for that dry granular product to get into the soil, similar to the liquid?
Yeah, so the question was, when we're comparing liquid wide drop to dry wide drop, and it comes to timing, does the dry wide drop need to be done earlier? I would say you need to use some agronomic sense. Dry drop, as you move west and you lower your precipitation, I would be a little bit more cautious on making sure you get that fertilizer into the crop row. Now, as far as timing when you're out in Illinois and you have plenty of moisture, I think you could even push that dry wide drop late to V9, V10. You just have to make sure you have good pre-plant fertility. We saw that with that rain funneling effect, later applications, it went into the ground pretty quickly.
Did you have a response in your fertility mix? And I'm almost embarrassed to say we're really, really old school. We still have dry fertilizer on the corn planter. But, the question is, we keep our K numbers up, but we're just running N and P, AMS and MAP through the planter.
So I think the question was, I think you're asking about putting that potassium early on pre-plant with your dry planting system. I do think there's some value in having pre-plant potassium early. I would not say that's maybe the nutrient that you're setting the yield potential with. I think that's more the nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. I like the idea of putting every nutrient up front because I know it's going to be available. But you do have to be a little bit careful sometimes with salts if you're putting potassium close to that seed with planting. That's where I do like having a deep band. You can put a decent amount of potassium if you're going deep. Or if I needed to, that's why we tried out the dry drop, because I can safely put on the potassium. So putting potassium on with the planter, it's not one of the nutrients I know has to be there right from the beginning unless I'm deficient in the soil. I think nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur are those ones that you want to make sure you have early, but you cannot forget about potassium either.
Right here, Scott, hold on.
Oh, we got one over here, and then I'll come back to you.
Your research clearly shows that banding is preferable to broadcasting, but would I be correct to say that it looks like it's a toss-up between incorporating banded fertilizer and not incorporating banded fertilizer?
Okay, yes. So the question is we really have good responses to banding, but the question is there really a big difference between the dry drop, which is unincorporated banding, and the actual pre-plant banding where I'm incorporating it into the ground. In this study, we did not see a big difference as far as yield efficiency. But I will say, with dry wide drop, you do have to be a little bit careful. I would not put that on a hillside. If you have a little bit drier condition, it is going to be harder to get it into the soil surface. And if you have a gully washer putting phosphate on the soil surface, you do have to be a little bit careful with that. I think potassium is excellent applicability, but I would say pre-plant banding is probably a little bit more of a less risk, and I would use the dry drop as a great backup alternative. But in our case, yes, plain and simple, we had great efficiency even with the unincorporated banding next to that crop row. Now, I would not say just unincorporated pre-plant banding would be the same, because having it next to that growing crop where that moisture is helping incorporate it in from the corn leaves, I think that's going to be essential. So I wouldn't just do a unincorporated pre-plant band. Question over here.
Yes. Did you do any tissue testing to see how those nutrients move through the soil or into the plants to quantify that? And then also, could you pull back up the dry drop picture?
The dry drop picture, yes. As I'm answering that, I will try to go back. You guys yell at me if I have to stop. So when it comes to the tissue sampling, we do not actually do tissue sampling on this study. What I do is at the end of the season, we sample the entire plant, we dry it down, we weigh it, and then we analyze for nutrients. So I do know for a fact that total pounds of P and K taken up in the crop was significantly higher when I was banding pre-plant and when I was doing dry drop. The problem sometimes when you guys do tissue samples, go out, put 1034-0 in furrow or a starter, you'll see a growth response, but you take a tissue sample, sometimes there's not a higher concentration of phosphate. As you increase the above ground growth of that crop, the nutrients are then diluted by more vegetative biomass. So sometimes a tissue sample, when you're working with really big growth responses to fertility, it can be misleading. So that's why we sample the entire crop so we know exactly what the weight and total uptake is. Oh, the machine. There you go.
Where did the dry drop or the banding, did you figure out which component, was it more kernels or was it more test weight compared in the dry drop versus banding?
Yes, so the question was, when we were doing this pre-plant banding, we're doing the dry wide drop and whatnot, of those yield components, plants per acre, kernels per plant, and weight per kernel, which one was affected most? What was really interesting is when we were concentrating that fertilizer, whether it was dry drop or pre-plant banding, what we found was we were increasing the number of kernels per plant. We weren't increasing kernel weights, but by increasing the number of kernels per plant, we were able to maintain that kernel weight. So normally, when you increase kernels per plant, you decrease kernel weight. We were able to just maintain that kernel weight. I do think if you got even more intensive in management, you're talking fungicide irrigation, you would be able to increase everything. Okay. Any more questions?
Got one here.
All right, let's hear it.
On the pre-plant banding, at what depth were you guys running it, and did you find any difference in, banding everything at, 2, 4, 6, 8, whatever
Yes.
depth?
That is a great question. The question was, what was the depth that we were banding? Dr. Below is going to have my butt for not making sure I clarified this in the beginning. We were banding with a Coulter-type toolbar, so I was blowing fertilizer about 4 to 6 inches deep. And then I was just closing that up with some closing wheels in the end, and I plant directly over top of it. We do not do research on varying the depth, but ours is about 4 to 6 inches deep.
We got time for one more.
There in the back.
Well, maybe two more.
Could you maybe touch on the importance of spring banding versus fall banding?
Yes. So the question was, what is my thoughts on fall banding compared to spring banding? In our research, we've had fantastic responses with spring banding. In the fall, we've actually had less efficiency from that banded application. And that can come down to just the longer that fertilizer is in the soil, it's getting worked on, it's getting tied up, you're losing some of it. Another thing that we've seen, when we band, say, MAP, microessentials in the fall, we know that nitrogen that's in that, it's really not being available come springtime. We've done a lot of studies where we've watched fall applied nitrogen in Champaign, Illinois, from the MAP microessentials, it's almost gone. 90% of it basically. So not only just from the agronomics of how much nitrogen is there in the spring, we've seen by concentrating that nutrient right at planting, that's where you're increasing the number of kernels per plant, but I am making sure that fertilizer is available late in the season, and that's where we help with kernel weight. So I really am an opponent of spring banding compared to fall. I do know it's not easy, though, but it's worth it.
All right, we're at our time. We really want to discuss more questions with you. We're going to take this one last fantastic opportunity to do a photo op. This is obviously a cost of doing business. That was by design.
Here's sideways.
All right, here we go on 3. And 1, 2, 3. And 1, 2, 3.
Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of the Commodity Classic. Do not forget the survey if we didn't suck. So, hope to see you down in the Calmer Corn booth.
Yes, if you guys ask me enough difficult questions, maybe Dr. Below will let me by on my defense.